Haile Selassie, last emperor of Ethiopia and architect of modern Africa. The last emperor of 3,000-year-old Ethiopian monarchy was an accomplished politician for the modern age, as well as being revered as a living god, says Nige Tassel. Armed with a thick wad of papers, a diminutive middle-aged man from East Africa slowly approached the podium at the General Assembly of the League of Nations in Geneva on the 20th of June 1936. His pace was both measured and rebellious, the composure of a man with a purpose. He was the Emperor of Ethiopia, and his name was Haile Selassie. Hello Displorers, welcome to the channel and to yet another interesting video brought to you by Displore. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss out on any of our new uploads. The Emperor had traveled to Switzerland to test the League of Nations solidarity. As the leader of one of the few African countries not under colonial rule, Selassie was there to request assistance in defeating a violent aggressor. In October 1935, Italian dictator Benito Mussolini had ordered the invasion and occupation of Ethiopia as part of his grand design to create a latter-day Roman Empire in the Horn of Africa. The Ethiopian army couldn't withstand the might of the Italian forces, whose use of air power and chemical weapons overwhelmed them. Selassie, the man known as the Lion of Judah to his subjects, was pushed into exile. Despite Ethiopia having been a member of the League since 1923, Selassie received sympathetic applause and little else. Instead, the League actually decided to lift the sanctions imposed on Italy. But while he failed to mobilize the Western world against Mussolini, Selassie's appearance in Geneva did make him known worldwide. Named as Time magazine's Man of the Year, he would become one of the 20th century's most recognizable African leaders and a man still revered, even worshipped in certain parts of the world today. This brings us to the big question: who was Haile Selassie? Selassie had been Ethiopia's sovereign for half a decade when Italy launched its invasion. Born in a mud and wattle hut in 1892, his birthplace contradicted his genealogy and pedigree. His given name was Tafari Makonnen Wolde Michael, and he was a member of the Solomonic dynasty descended from King Solomon of Israel. He married the niece of the heir to the throne, and after notable depositions, by 1916, Tafari Makonnen had worked his way up to the position of crowned prince. Appealing to both traditional and modern quarters in high-ranking Ethiopian society, he was now heir to the throne. On the death of Empress Zewditu in 1930, Tafari became emperor, taking the name Haile Selassie. In rising to power, Selassie had shown his political agility when outflanking his opponents. He was undeniably ruthless, a characteristic that his short, wiry frame seemed to disguise. One political enemy described him thus: "He creeps like a mouse, but he has the jaws of a lion." Operating many years before the phrase came into circulation, he was a fighter who very much punched above his weight. The 225th emperor in the lineage stretching back from 3 millennia, Selassie was its most worldly. As crowned prince, in 1923 he had signed Ethiopia up to membership of the newly formed League of Nations. His thinking behind the decision was clear-eyed and pragmatic. "We need European progress only because we are surrounded by it," he said in one of his speeches. Selassie was a true internationalist, one confirmed by his later adoption of the ideals of Pan-Africanism. While still a believer in the divine rights of kings, Selassie attempted to reduce the iniquities in Ethiopian society that were highly conspicuous in the early years of his rule. In 1931, he introduced the country's first written constitution before embarking on the program to establish schools across the country. Ethiopia had taken its first steps on the road to modernity when Mussolini's troops landed in the autumn of 1935. Churchill and Mr. Strong. Forced into exile as the Italians approached Addis Ababa the following spring, Selassie traveled to Britain, initially staying in London before spending 4 years in Bath. When the Italians attacked British Somaliland, a devastating counter-offensive pushed them back. Ethiopia was now under British control, and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill authorized Selassie's return to Africa, flying the emperor to Egypt disguised under the false name of Mr. Strong. Selassie arrived back in Addis Ababa on 5th May 1941 in the back of an Alfa Romeo, exactly 5 years to the day since Italians had entered the capital. There he received a cable from Churchill. It is with deep pleasure that the British nation and empire have learned of your Imperial Majesty's welcome home. Your Majesty was the first of the lawful sovereigns to be driven from his throne and country by the fascist Nazi criminals, and you are the first to return in triumph. Ethiopia remained under British administration for a few months before having its sovereignty returned the following January. Back on the throne, Selassie wasted no time in continuing Ethiopia's march towards modernity. In 1942, he abolished any legal basis for slavery, making several slave-related offenses punishable by death. At the end of the Second World War, he continued his commitment to collective security, despite the disappointment of Geneva in 1936 by signing his country up to the new United Nations. He even sent troops to aid the United Nations Command in the Korean War. Selassie continued to advance Ethiopia domestically too. In 1955, a second constitution extended voting rights to every citizen, making the Ethiopian parliament's lower house an elected chamber. After all, the wording of the constitution itself reiterated that the person of the emperor is sacred, his dignity is inviolable, and his power indisputable. In 1963, Selassie helped found the Organization of African Unity, drawing up its charter and successfully persuading 31 other independent African nations to join. The political agility that had originally brought him to power seemingly knew no bounds. At the very height of the Cold War, he was even able to secure foreign aid from both the US and the USSR. Haile Selassie and Rastafarianism. Despite being the subject of a failed coup in 1960 while in Brazil, Selassie continued his state visits. In 1966, he made his most symbolic overseas appearance since his appeal to the League of Nations 30 years before, when he visited Jamaica. In 1916, the Jamaican black nationalist activist Marcus Garvey had instructed his followers to look to Africa for the crowning of a black king. He shall be the Redeemer. So when Selassie ascended the Ethiopian throne in 1930, to many Jamaicans, he was the Redeemer Garvey had spoken about, the Black Messiah. A new religion that took its name from Selassie's birth name, Rastafarianism, was born. Even so, as his plane landed at Palisados Airport in Kingston on the 21st of April 1966, Selassie couldn't have been prepared for the scenes. The island's Rastafarians, instantly recognizable by their dreadlocks and unkempt beards, in marked sartorial contrast to Selassie's full military clothing, had convened in their tens of thousands. They broke the police lines and swans around the Emperor's DC-6, reported a correspondent from the Life magazine. They kept touching his plane, yelling, "God is here," but Selassie seemed to love the attention these strange, wild-eyed, lawless, and fierce Jamaicans gave him. On the fade. As symbolic as the trip had been, back in Ethiopia, Selassie's star was on the decline. Having encouraged the education of his subjects, often at schools and universities overseas, the emperor was now open to criticism from these same citizens who could measure the slow speed of social and economic progress in their homeland. And now well into his 70s, Selassie's sharp political brain was losing its edge. A famine between 1972 and 1974, with estimated losses of lives into the hundreds of thousands, gravely damaged Selassie's popularity and destabilized his regime. In February 1974, Addis Ababa saw 4 days of rioting, followed by an extended general strike the following month. Members of the military were amongst the angriest, voicing their dissent about low pay and not appeased by Selassie's promises of a 33% rise in salaries. They deposed the emperor in September 1974, placing him under house arrest. The intention was to put Selassie's son, Crown Prince Asfor Warson, who was out of the country at the time of the deposition, on the throne. However, when the prince condemned the event of Blood Saturday, which saw 60 high-ranking Selassie loyalists executed, the interim military administration, known as the Derg, renounced his right to succession. The Derg remained in power, ending 3,000 years of monarchical rule. On 27th of August 1975, at the age of 83, Haile Selassie died. The official reason given was respiratory failure after a prostate operation. His supporters continued to believe he was murdered by the Derg. In 1992, after the fall of the Derg, Selassie's bones were discovered under concrete in the grounds of his palace. Some reports even suggested that he had been buried beneath a latrine. And if this is true, it was an auspicious, ungracious end to the life of one of the chief architects of modern Africa. There you have it, explorers, the reign and the death of Haile Selassie, last emperor of Ethiopia. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to give it a thumbs up, leave a comment in the comment section, and the best comment will be pinned. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel and also share with a friend.